As you all know, we had hoped to gather in April 2020 for the LPE Democracy Beyond Neoliberalism conference. And while we were disappointed not to be able to come together in person as a community, we are thrilled to be hosting our reconstructed virtual conference series, thanks to the generosity, patience, and hard work of our community. Our entire lineup of events and registration links, as well as a sneak peek of our upcoming blog symposia, are available on our website, where you can sign up for conference-specific updates and reminders. Our next event, titled Globalization After Neoliberalism, with Sonia Roland, David Trubeck, Dan Danielson, Alvaro Santos, and faculty co-director David Graywall, will take place tomorrow from 4 to 5:30 p.m. ET. So now it is my pleasure to introduce today's student moderator and my friend, Tarek Al-Gabalawi. Tarek is a 3L at UC Irvine School of Law and currently serves as a student editor at the LPE blog. Tarek is interested in resistance to carceral violence and policing, and recently organized a blog symposium on LPE and the criminal legal system. After law school, he plans to work as a post-bar for the Los Angeles Public Defender's Office.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you everyone for joining the LPE Projects Conference on Racial Capitalism. I am so excited for today's conversation, and in a moment, I will have the great pleasure of introducing our amazing panelists, who will each have some time to speak on their groundbreaking work regarding race, capital production, and the law, as well as the similarities between their works. And then at the end, we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A, so be ready with your questions. Before we get started, though, I'd like to just take a quick moment to acknowledge Raul Carrillo, Caroline Parker, Corinne Blaylock, and everyone else at the LPE project. Thank you all so much for bringing us together for this very important conversation. And so before we do introductions, I just quickly wanted to say that if you're like me, when you heard the term racial capitalism, you probably wondered, sounds important, but what is that? So in a general sense, racial capitalism refers to the process by which targeted racial oppression is used to produce economic value for a dominant racial caste. In the context of American and European history, it refers to how Black and brown bodies and their labor were exploited for the benefit of white ruling elites, be they businessmen or politicians. Although this is admittedly a pretty bare definition, I'm sure it already brings to mind several examples from history and today's socioeconomic landscape of how race is exploited to build wealth. Modern American, if not global capitalism, began with our government's collusion with cotton growers to exploit enslaved labor to launch the cotton economy. The American project was only possible with the theft and desecration of indigenous land, particularly the theft of Choctaw land for cotton growing in the Mississippi Delta. The exploitation of Chinese railroad workers by railroad companies to launch the first transcontinental railroad, making trade possible across the country and uniting the states. Modern examples can be seen in the exploitation and fight for greater protections amongst Amazon warehouse workers, underpaid workers for the big box stores, hotel workers and domestic workers more generally, particularly those who service big financial institutions, and the criminalization of immigration which facilitates the exploitation of farm workers and other laborers responsible for so much of what keeps us fed, clothed, and living in a functioning society. The conversation today will examine racial capitalism's connection to political economy and the larger implications racial capitalist structures have on communities of color and other marginalized groups. Our panelists today have studied the connection between the law and racial capitalism and investigated the central role that race and racism play in constructing the foundation of modern capitalist economy. Instead of locating racism outside the institutional structure of capitalism, these panelists re-theorize racism as lying at the heart of our country's economic past and present. This repositioning prompts important questions about the relationship of human freedom and exploitation to the world of so-called free markets. And so without further ado, I'd just like to take a quick moment to introduce each of our panelists one by one, and then we'll dive right into their quick 10-minute addresses. So first, we have Professor Marisa Baradaron. Professor Baradaran is a renowned legal scholar whose work on banking, law, financial inclusion, inequality, and the racial wealth gap has received significant national and international media coverage, a professor at law at UC Irvine. Her scholarship includes the books How the Other Half Banks on the Two Separate Banking Systems in This Country, one which serves the well-to-do and the other that exploits everyone else, and argues that the solution is re-enlisting the US Post Office in its historic function of providing bank services. And the second is The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap, which examines past policies and the operation of banking in a segregated economy to argue that only bold fundamental reforms and racial redress that acknowledge banking's relation to the Black community will end the cycle of poverty and promote Black wealth, challenging the longstanding notion that Black banking, community self-help are the solution to the racial wealth gap. Next, we have Professor Veena Dubal from UC Hastings School of Law. Professor Dubal researches the intersection of law, technology, and precarious work using the empirical methodologies in critical theory to understand the impact of digital technologies on emerging legal frameworks and the lives of workers, the co-constitutive influences of law and work on identity, and the role of law and lawyers in solidarity movements. In addition to her important legal scholarship, Professor Dubal conducted an ethnography of, I'm getting caught up on my words, and an ethnography of the San Francisco taxi industry to receive her JD and PhD from UC Berkeley. She worked as a public interest attorney and was the Berkeley Law Foundation Fellow at the Asian Law Caucus, where she founded a taxi worker project and represented Muslim Americans in civil rights cases. Based on over a decade of ethnographic and historical study, Professor Dubal is currently writing a manuscript, Driving Freedom, Navigating Neoliberalism, on how 5 decades of shifting technologies and emergent regulatory regimes changed the everyday lives and work of ride-hail drivers in San Francisco. Next, we have Professor Angela Harris. Professor Harris is a distinguished professor of law at UC Davis, and she writes widely in the field of critical legal theory, examining how law sometimes reinforces and sometimes challenges subordination on the basis of race, gender, sexuality, class, and other dimensions of power and identity. Her writings and influential articles in critical legal theory have been widely anthologized and translated, and she is also a prolific co-author of case books, including Criminal Law, Cases and Material, Race and Races, Cases and Materials for a Diverse America, Gender and Law, and Economic Justice. Professor Harris's career Professor Harris's career as an academic speaks for itself, and as a teacher too. At UC Berkeley, she taught the school's first seminar in environmental justice, and at the University of Buffalo School of Law, she helped pioneer a seminar called Mindfulness and Professional Identity, Becoming a Lawyer While Keeping Your Values Intact. And in addition to receiving the awards for her mentorship, teaching, and scholarship, she is the founder of the Thelton E. Henderson Center for Social Justice at UC Berkeley, as well as the Aoki Center for Critical Race and Nation Studies at UC Davis. Next, we have Professor Athena Matua. Professor Matua's research and teaching at the University at Buffalo School of Law focuses on civil rights, corporations, and critical race and feminist legal theory. Her work includes the edited collection, Progressive Black Masculinities, and articles titled Restoring Justice to the Civil Rights Movement Activist, A New Histography and the Long Civil Rights Era, The Rise, Development, and Future Directions of Critical Race Theory, and Gender Equality and Women's Solidarity Across Religious, Ethnic, and Class Differences in the Kenya Constitutional Review Process. The later article involved activism and research, for which she received the University of Buffalo Exceptional Scholars Young Investigators Award, and her article introducing class crit from class blindness to a critical legal analysis of economic inequality explores issues of race and gender as they relate to class structures, and introduces the concepts and boundaries of class crits, a project she helped found. Next, we have Professor K-Sue Park from Georgetown University Law Center. Professor K-Sue Park's scholarship examines the creation of the American real estate system and the historical connections between property law, immigration law, and American Indian law. At Georgetown, Professor Park teaches first-year property in a seminar entitled Land Dispossession and Displacement, Previously, she was the Critical Race Studies Fellow at UCLA School of Law and an Equal Justice Works Fellow and staff attorney in El Paso, where she investigated predatory mortgage lending schemes as part of Texas Rio Grande's legal aid's foreclosure defense team. Park earned her BA summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa honors from Cornell University, where she was a college scholar, her master's in philosophy with distinction in social and political sciences from the University of Cambridge, her JD cum laude from Harvard Law School, where she was a presidential scholar, and her PhD in rhetoric from UC Berkeley, where she was a Javits Fellow. She is also a former Fulbright scholar, and in 2015, her article, Money Mortgages and the Conquest of America, won the American Bar Foundation's graduate student paper competition and the Association for Law, Culture, and the Humanities Austin Surratt Award, and was selected for the Law and Humanities Junior Scholarship Workshop. Her publications have appeared in the Harvard Law Review, the History of Present, Law and Social Inquiry, Law and Society Review, and the New York Times. And last but definitely not least, we have Daria Roithmeyer from USC Gould School of Law. Daria teaches and writes about structural racism in labor, housing, political participation, wealth, and education at USC. She published her book, Reproducing Racism, How Everyday Choices How Everyday Choices Lock in White Advantage, which argues that racial segregation and the racial wealth gaps reproduce themselves structurally over time. Early racial advantages begets later advantages, even in the absence of intentional discrimination. She is now at work on a new book, Racism Pays, which argues that our country's most celebrated innovations in the modern digital economy have relied on racial exploitation of workers of color to get off the ground. So without any further ado, because I'm sure you guys didn't come here to hear me speak, I'm going to pass it off to our panelists. We didn't really talk about an order, but let's go in the order that I introduced you guys. So Professor Baradaran, do you want to take us off?
Sure. I mean, I'm more here for the, can you hear me okay? Yes. I'm here for the discussion, so I will keep my comments really short. But, you know, when we talk about the role of credit policies and economic theories that we've used sort of, you know, as political economy frameworks or just as economic frameworks, the racial caste system is embedded in all of those structures. And in my last book, The Color of Money, I looked at the racial wealth gaps development over time using bank balance sheets and the federal government's credit programs. And you know, I think one of the staggering things about the racial wealth gap is that it has not diminished, it has grown over time, you know, matched to sort of, you know, inflation adjusted. And so to say that our public policy efforts to eradicate the racial wealth gap have been a total failure would be an understatement. And so talking about democracy and money and markets, we have to consider how racism and racial exclusion exposes the myths around those very topics themselves. So markets and democracy. I wanted to focus specifically on Black banks because that history, I think, sheds a light on the relationship between markets and state power. In fact, I think it is the lies or the myths that we tell about markets that present some of the biggest obstacles of closing the racial wealth gap and recognizing the racial capitalism at the core of the market, and then, of course, achieving economic justice. I hardly need to preach to this choir about these myths, but I'll lay them out anyway. One myth is that money, markets, and trade exist outside of the realm of political power. Two, that inequality is a natural byproduct of market forces rather than being created by the state. And three, that the people left outside of the structures of power can overcome these barriers through self-help institutions or local self-help solutions or local institutions. The promise of free market capitalism itself is that it does not discriminate. Right? Free markets offer equal opportunity for all to trade and prosper based on one's skill and ability to produce. Yet, of course, history reveals that, in fact, markets do discriminate, or alternatively, that the American economy has never borne any resemblance to a free market. For most of our history, Black men and women have been excluded from occupation, schools, neighborhoods, and trades, and their property, importantly, wasn't protected by law. Money, likewise, is said to be apolitical. But as Christine Desan at Harvard's book Making Money explains in her sort of conclusion, that the revisionist history of money likened it to water, neutral and colorless, outside of the infrastructures of power. And in fact, I think we all can recognize that the money does have a color, and for most of U.S. history, the color has been white. White too was government credit, capital, Homestead Act, FHA loans. Black communities were consistently and thoroughly cut out of land and wealth accumulation, purposefully. And more importantly, or more perniciously, I would say, at certain pivot points in history, specifically during Reconstruction and the Civil Rights era, and I think we may be possibly at another one, which is why it would be important it's important to look at what went wrong the last couple of times, but where Black communities and claims for justice have sort of risen to the level of public consciousness, where people started paying attention to the demands for justice, and where state intervention and sort of capital allocation were required to remedy past injustices. So specifically, right, Reconstruction, the land grant, and which was not to be, and in the Civil Rights era, with very explicit capital platforms, either reparations or some sort of New Deal era program that would have built wealth in the Black community. And in each moment, the rhetoric of free market capitalism was used as a weapon to cut down those claims. And instead, a self-help market of segregated banks and businesses are offered as a decoy from other potentially more direct avenues for inclusion in the economy. In other words, the leaders upholding the dominance of white market institutions promised that the market would fix the problems that had been created by law and backed by private violence. And of course, this myth gets at my larger academic project, and I guess we write because we have these pet peeves. And my pet peeve has been this idea that this myth of the small community bank or cooperative, right? These small people can pool their money together and lift themselves out of poverty. That poverty or any sort of exclusion has a personal remedy, and that banks can, outside of the structure of the federal government and the subsidies on which they rest, do something beyond what is being offered through the mainstream economy. So this is one, of course, example of this, but there are others, and so I think the perniciousness of the way that these self-help tools get re-brought up deserves our academic attention, because it's an alluring myth. So I will, I think, leave it at that, and let my co-panelists have some time so that we can hopefully talk about how our various projects intersect. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Baradaran. I just want to jump in. I know that we said we were going to go in the order that I announced, but some of the panelists have messaged me and let me know that there's a better way of doing things, which is usually the case. So next, I want to ask Professor Matua if she could go.
All righty. Thank you all for being here. Special thanks to the LPE project for sponsoring this event. I'm pretty excited. And also, I'd like to thank my co-panelists for their fabulous work. So I'm going to talk today about project Carmen Gonzalez and I are engaged in terms of mapping racial capitalism, with some mention of zones of sacrifice, which are sacrificial zones, which is kind of where our work really begins. But I'm going to map today. And so I want to share my screen. I hope I can do this with you. Let's see if I can. All righty. And hopefully you all will kind of give me a 2-minute warning. All righty. So we're mapping racial capitalism and exploring um, zones of sacrifice. And let me see if I can move this. And I'm going to put up this chart. I am not going to really explain it. I'll explain it if we have time later. For the moment, you can focus on the words in red: exploitation, expropriation, and expulsion. And then this idea of accumulation or profit imperative. And the ideal taken from Eric Olin Wright is that what's important is that power relations and legal rules, we're focusing on power relations and legal rules, which give people effective control over economic resources. So I think that racial capitalism, as we are showing, is a promising area for legal scholarship. It offers insights into the relationship between class and race, and in doing so, it provides a structural and a larger global historical account of the ways in which race and class are linked. Though legal scholars have begun to explore the concept, Carmen and I believe that the concept requires further elaboration. So we have been asking, how does it work? How does it work? Consequently, we're writing a paper that sketches out what we believe are, at least tentatively believe, are the key structural features of racial capitalism. And these key structural features include the central goal of profit making, right, with all its processes of accumulation, race making, and segregated space, all of which were present at racial capitalism's birth, and which together we argue create or often create and produce zones of sacrifice. At the same time, we believe that law plays a key role in the structure and processes of racial capitalism. So this is another chart. This is really kind of influenced. The first chart is influenced by Eric Olin Wright's sociologist sketches. The second is trying to kind of map out a little bit of racial capitalism from the perspective of Nancy Fraser's hidden abodes. Okay, but specifically, we posit that racial capitalism operates through grounding its processes of exploitation, expropriation, expulsion in race making, and that these are further facilitated by segregation and creating these zones of sacrifice. From this perspective, then, racial capitalism rejects the idea that exploitation of free waged labor is the essence of capitalism. Rather, it understands that the system is also dependent on free nature and the unfreed, unpaid, and underpaid labor of women and those generally racialized as inferior, living in separate, segregated space, a space too often converted into sacrifice zones. Consequently, racial capitalism does not simply rely, as was said earlier, on economic power or market discipline, which requires the majority of the world's people to work for others or starve, but also relies on the attainment and exercise of the raw coercive power deployed or authorized by the state, including mob violence. And so now I'm just going to kind of move to a definition. So we posit that accumulation is both structured and justified by law. And one might characterize some of these processes as legal and extra legal practices of looting socially and collectively produced wealth. So exploitation entails, it's fairly traditional, entails the production of commodities and services by a labor force that has limited or no independent access to the means of subsistence, and thus exchanges this labor powerful wages on a market. These workers labor pursuant to wage contracts in which the capitalists are entitled to legally appropriate the lion's share of the collectively and socially produced wealth. Theoretically, these workers are often perceived as both free and independent citizens, and theoretically they earn enough money to meet their basic needs and to socially reproduce themselves. Expropriation, on the other hand, entails dispossessing, confiscating, stealing, and taking, often brutally, the persons, bodies, labors of people and nature's resources without acknowledging and paying the necessary costs for the work or for paying for their social and natural reproduction. In other words, human workers are often unfreed, unpaid, and underpaid, and their lives and their social needs are devalued if they're valued at all. At the same time, nature's energy and work is also expropriated. Here, extraction and processes of altering both animals' lives and habitats and the earth itself is accomplished without acknowledging or paying the cost for it, or the full cost for it, or for the social, environmental, or ecosystems reproduction and replenishment. And as Fraser says, the goal is not for the purposes of plunder, but rather to insert these human, non-human, and material resources into the circuits of accumulation for private appropriation by law.
Professor Matua, this is just a 2-minute warning.
2 minute, right. Thank you. Expulsion. Expulsion is an integral part of and the result of the first two processes. Here, people are expelled from life-affirming opportunities and placed either in a holding pattern as reserved labor or along with non-human workers, disposed of when their labor is exhausted or deemed unnecessary through practices of warehousing, deportation, or elimination. But here, even that which is disposed of or waste can be recycled into the circuits of capitalism and thus becomes another arm or way of accumulating wealth. Race making. So we argue that and suggest that race making grounds the different processes of exploitation, expropriation, and expulsion. And race making involves the process of dividing humanity into a social hierarchy of different superior and inferior races as a means of both leveraging profit making through the production of commodities and or earning super profits. And it often works as a stabilizing system. And I will leave that there. Segregation, we know racial capitalism was born in colonialism, as Quijano explains. Specifically, it was born out of the brutal colonization of the Americas with its practices of genocide, mass land seizure, and slavery. In this transnational birth and entrenchment, racial capitalism involved a division of labor involving different groups occupying different spaces with different resource endowments, and they were coerced into producing for the world market. Thus, it's unsurprising that separation and segregation of different laboring populations was later intentionally pursued within nations to both spur racial capitalism's growth and its maintenance. Thus, a segregation plays a major role in racial capitalism's organization as a set of spatial practices or logics that facilitate the efficient operation of racial capitalism's different modes of racialized and accumulation. And finally, and I'll stop here, segregation spaces, and I'll just read this, is all too often converted into sacrifice zones. In these zones, occupants are not only expelled from life-affirming opportunities, but subjected to a wide range of structural and physical violence. These include, among others, police brutality, because these are not independent citizens, right? So to speak, or not treated as such. So these include, among others, police brutality and the slow violence of polluting facilities, contaminated air and water, and life-threatening disasters caused or exacerbated by climate change. And then our real novel work begins here. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
I guess, should I just go, Tarek? Is that okay? Okay, we're just gonna go. So I am just very quickly gonna share my screen. So before I begin, I just want to thank the organizers and the reorganizers of this conference and this panel in particular. You know, we were stymied last spring, and so much work has gone into making this happen today. And so thank you so much. I'm so honored to be speaking amongst you. I know there are people in the audience who I've learned so much from, also on this panel who I've learned so much from. So it's truly a humbling honor to be giving this talk. Before I begin, I just want to note that this talk emerges from a working article that's going to be published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. And the article and the talk are dedicated to my beloved late brother, Sam Dubal, who centered the fight against racial injustices in his everyday life and in his scholarly research and writing, and ensured that I did the same. Sam, who passed away while I was writing this article and whose many insightful comments shaped its trajectory, was a medical doctor and accomplished cultural anthropologist. He dedicated his too short life to urging us to embrace radical hope and the possibilities enabled by imagining and striving toward mutual liberation. Excuse me. On August 28th, 2020, the anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech at the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, residents of downtown Oakland awoke to a prominent new billboard advertisement. On the corner of Broadway and Webster Street, directly above a popular lounge in the city's East African immigrant community, a large black and white advertisement read, "If you tolerate racism, delete Uber." Several months into the global coronavirus pandemic that disproportionately killed African Americans, and amidst a historic summer of Black Lives Matter protests prompted by the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, similar Uber billboards were erected in cities across the US. The slogan, "If you tolerate racism, delete Uber," drew upon and cleverly appropriated the memorable #DeleteUber campaign launched by the New York Taxi Workers Alliance during the Muslim ban protests 4 years earlier. In solidarity with protesters and Muslim immigrant taxi, Uber, and Lyft drivers in New York City, the New York Taxi Workers Alliance organized a ride-hail work stoppage at JFK Airport. Shortly thereafter, Uber's surge pricing directed drivers to the JFK airport, resulting in an algorithmically enabled strike bust. This in turn outraged Muslim ban protesters who advanced the New York Taxi Workers Alliance to #DeleteUber in the name of racial and economic justice. 4 years later, Uber's "If you tolerate racism, delete Uber" marketing slogan was illegible to many of its drivers. The morning after the billboard was erected in downtown Oakland, home to some of the most important Black Power movements and civil rights protests in US history, an Uber driver snapped a photo of the sign on his smartphone and messaged it in a group text. "What does this even mean?" the driver asked. For roughly 7 months, members of this primarily immigrant and people of color workforce had been organizing to prevent Proposition 22 from passing. The initiative threatened to take away the employment rights legally entitled to California gig workers and to codify a third category of worker. Most of these drivers had been laboring for Uber and its competitor Lyft for over half a decade. They had experienced the real life impacts of continual wage cuts, black box algorithmic control, and misclassification as independent contractors. As the coronavirus pandemic ravaged their communities and drastically reduced ride-hail demand, many were forced to choose between risking exposure to the virus or hunger. For African-American ride-hail drivers like Sherry Murphy, the attempt to cloak the company in anti-racism was both confusing and infuriating. Economic justice, she told me, is racial justice. Alongside a coalition of drivers and driver groups, Sherry co-organized a protest in front of the Uber billboard. Masked gig workers held up a countersign mirroring the font and aesthetic of Uber's billboard. It read, "If you support racial justice, vote no on Proposition 22." This proposition, the workers explained at the protest, was the most expensive ballot initiative in California history, and yet it would take away the basic economic rights that the California legislature and courts had affirmed that gig workers were owed, including the minimum wage, overtime protections, unemployment insurance, and reimbursements for expenses. In sponsoring the initiative, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Postmates, and Instacart had invested a record $203 million to campaign for, among other things, a differential wage code for the sector, which would effectively legalize piece payment for most of the app-deployed workforce. Uber's billboard and the gig workers' protest made race visible as essential not only to Prop 22 in the third category of worker, but the entire sector of gig work. In 2020, an estimated 70% of Uber and Lyft drivers in California were people of color and immigrants. In 2019, in San Francisco, 78% of the ride, hail, and delivery workers were people of color. Over 70% worked more than 30 hours a week, and most relied on these jobs as their primary source of income. Some made no money after considering vehicle expenses. Perhaps prompted by these economic and demographic realities, the gig companies attempted to address race head on. Uber launched not only the billboard campaign, but announced that it was an anti-racist company, in a blog post by CEO Dara Khosrowshahi. Lyft, for its part, unveiled Lyft Up, an initiative to provide donated rides to underserved communities. But many drivers disavowed these company gestures. Their lives and identities, they insisted, were being instrumentalized for profit. In November 2020, Proposition 22 passed with a 58.6% approval, effectively creating a third category of worker and a differential wage code for a majority people of color sector in California. Technology capitalists heralded the passage as a boon for innovation, an example of how new laws could catch up to the technological present and advance the future of work. This configuration, however, elided not just the impacts of the law for this workforce, but also the historical roots of differential wage codes. Indeed, this was not the first time workers of color had been carved out of the protection of employment laws. Like Uber and Lyft, early 20th century industrialists had campaigned for differential wage regulations and even achieved sectoral carve-outs for majority African-American workforces. With this reality in mind, in this article, I ask, how can we understand Prop 22 in the third worker category within the history and purpose of laws that have governed the past and may govern the future for workers? Following Charles Mills's call to engage in knowledge production through a color-conscious genealogy and using legal and ethnographic methodologies, I situate Proposition 22 within the context of the long history of corporate battles over wage regulations in the US. I reframe the third category of worker against the backdrop of racialized wage codes proffered, debated, and passed during the first and second New Deals. In the debates following the passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act, for example, African-American civil society groups like the NAACP fought vociferously but failed to include enforceable anti-discrimination measures in the wage codes promulgated by the NRA, the National Recovery Act Administration, National Recovery Administration. In industries where wage codes were established, industrialists submitted wage codes to the NRA, which shamelessly included discriminatory provisions with reference to Black labor, arguing without evidence that African-American workers were less efficient than their white counterparts. After NERA was ruled unconstitutional on unrelated grounds and the regime of New Deal laws passed, the NERA exclusions and wage differentials were enacted through facially neutral carve-outs for more than 2/3 of African-American workers. Such facially neutral terms utilized in New Deal laws created and sustained generational poverty in African-American communities. The New Deal for African-American workers was, in the words of historian Harvard Sitkoff, an old deal or a raw deal. 2 decades later, the historic civil rights movement attempted to address these New Deal failures by demanding that discrimination in employment be explicitly outlawed, amongst other things. And enshrining the liberal legal rights to be free from racial discrimination at work, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 aspired toward a US capitalist democracy that could, in theory, fully integrate African Americans and immigrants of color. But despite the aspirations of this new race-neutral economic order, racial violence continued to work normatively in any number of ways, not least of which was through the legacy of New Deal worker carve-outs, which facilitated long-term wage differentials for most African-American workers, contributing to and defining in some ways what we call today the racial wage gap. Proposition 22 can be understood as a remarkable moment in this sea change of US capitalism and a continuation of this legacy of facially neutral wage carve-outs for a majority people of color workforce.
Professor Dubal, just 2 more minutes.
It is, I argue, the new racial wage code. But in contrast to New Deal era industrialists who relied on a rhetoric of racial inferiority to justify differential wage codes and work law exclusions for Black workers, in the fight to pass Proposition 22, technology industrialists relied upon a discourse of benevolent racial liberalism and imagined racial subjectivities. They benefited from explicitly racializing their workforce through campaign imagery and marketing. California voters were bombarded with photos of smiling Black and brown workers who the companies claimed needed and wanted the flexibility and independence that only gig work could offer, and that the employment protections would supposedly preclude. While simultaneously taking legal rights away from and lowering the wages of this workforce, the companies activated tropes endemic to neoliberal racialization. The single mom of color who needed flexible work, the immigrant father who couldn't make ends meet with his 3 other jobs. The company's commercials attempted to internalize in voting consumers a form of sentimental, race-attentive compassion while making invisible the structures caused by racialized insecurity. The official anti-racism of Uber and Lyft deployed not just through the campaign and company ads, but also through individual executives like African-American former Obama appointees Anthony Fox and Tony West, endeavored to disconnect capitalist developments in the app-based economy from racial injustice. By focusing on particular liberal discursive forms of anti-racism, corporate diversity, for example, anti-racism trainings for customer support operators, the companies abstracted the ideal of racial equality from the bodies of African-American workers. In sharp contrast, the gig workers who fought Prop 22 consistently revealed race to be a structuring force in the gig economy, both by pointing out the hypocrisies of the company's racial justice initiatives and by articulating how their everyday precarities were shaped by their racial identities. For these workers, the coronavirus-like police brutality also highlighted the ways in which the state had instrumentalized their bodies rather than caring for them. By executive order, these ride-hail drivers were deemed essential, meaning they could continue to work, yet claims to their essentiality made to both the state and to the companies for which they worked went mostly unheard. Amid so much injustice, instability, and struggle, workers turned to each other. Rooted in a politics of mutual aid, gig workers in California organized town halls and actions. They held several We Got Your Back PPE actions throughout the Bay Area, for example, to provide drivers with donated masks and other safety and cleaning equipment that the companies would not provide. And in the process, they communicated the dangers of the 3rd category of worker in explicitly racial terms. Building on these workers' reflections and situating their analyses within a longer history of differential wage codes, I argue that facially neutral employment and labor law carve-outs for the highly racialized gig sector reproduce and are made possible by racial subjugation. As the technology capitalists attempt to spread this 3rd category to other states and other industries, my hope is that this article makes legible through both history and ethnography the ways in which this category is constituted by and through racial inequality. Thank you.
Thank you. I am just trying to get my screen sharing up here. All right, are you all able to see and hear this?
Yes.
All right, great. So thank you very much. And before I continue, I want to give.
We can't see your screen. We can't see your
screen.
screen.
See the screen? Okay, hang on. Thanks. All right, share screen. Are you sharing? Can you see anything?
No.
I'm clicking on share screen, but it is not allowing me to, I guess.
Should we go with K-Sue while you work that out?
Sure. Yeah, if the folks who are organizing can help me figure out how to share, that would be great.
Oh, there you go. Do you want to go ahead?
Oh, is it there?
It's
Okay.
up, yeah.
All right, thank you. Okay, how's that? All right, so I have a couple of shout outs before I start my presentation. One is I want to let folks know that I am the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Political Economy. We are a new online peer-reviewed journal powered by the University of California e-scholarship platform. So please take a moment if you enjoy the work that's being presented here today to check out the first couple of issues of our journal. We're committed to publishing work on racial capitalism along with all other subjects that are relevant to the law and political economy movement. So we would love your attention, and please check us out. The other announcement that I want to make is if you are enjoying the presentations being given here, please join us for a second panel on racial capitalism sponsored by Class Crits, which is going to be held March 10th, a Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you want to hear more, several of the presenters on this panel are also going to be talking about their work there. If you Google classcrits.org, you'll be able to find the information for registering. Okay, so with that, thank you for your patience. I'm speaking to you today from the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County, otherwise known as Berkeley, California. And I am going to start my remarks today with just saying a little bit, particularly for the students in the audience here, about the words that we use to describe our work. What words do I use, and do the words matter? Next, I'll present an overview of my larger project, which is developing an LPE approach to American agriculture. And there I'm finding two key questions useful in developing an analytical method. First, how does the political economy of US farming work? And then secondly, who is the political economy of US farming for? And in answering both questions, I'm interested in the role of both law and race as technologies. Okay, so a little bit about theoretical frames. There's at least three different theoretical frames in which I could place my work: critical race theory, racial capitalism, and LPE, law and political economy. And do those terms matter? For me, the answer is yes and no. On the one hand, scholars can look at the interactions of market institutions, race, and law within all three of these frames, and have done so and continue to do so. At the same time, for this project, I've chosen LPE as the primary frame in which I'm doing this work. Just a little bit about critical race theory. The central intellectual contribution of critical race theory, in my view, has been to call attention to the pervasiveness of white supremacy within discourses of racial equality, legal justice, and American constitutionalism. A lot of this work has focused on anti-discrimination law, and yet interest in the convergence of race, class, economics, and markets has also been very much there in critical race theory. So in this slide, I just wanted to shout out the work of Lisa Iglesias, who was writing 21 years ago about what she called the existence of a discursive legal structure in which the separation of politics and economics is routinely invoked to restrict democratic participation in economic decision-making. And she described this ideological structure as the anti-political economy. So CRT in some ways is really a precursor or a ground for the work that we're doing today under the frame of racial capitalism. In terms of racial capitalism, I think one thing that that this phrase adds is the conscious commitment to put questions of equal access aside and to focus instead on the role of race in structuring the very market-related institutions to which racialized minorities want or are said to want access or inclusion. And another reason why I think the racial capitalism frame is useful is because it's connecting us in legal scholarship to newly invigorated conversations in history, cultural studies, Black studies, and political theory, making capitalism a thing, a formation to be investigated and not just the air that we breathe. So I think it's really useful to have this frame that connects us in an interdisciplinary conversation. At the moment, though, for me, I find it useful to kind of bring forward the term LPE, or law and political economy, and why is that useful? Well, first, I think it helps underscore the possibility that race is present also in those discourses that seem to be race-free, including the broad fundamental terms of law, politics, and economics. We've seen a kind of intellectual apartheid with critical race theory, where scholars don't read it unless their work specifically engages with race. As LPE emerges as a new framework for scrutinizing our basic terms, I think it's important that race be considered central, not peripheral, to this inquiry into fundamentals. A second reason why I'm using LPE rather than racial capitalism is that I worry that the specificity of racial capitalism as a term invites a lot of unhelpful boundary work about what should and should not be included in its frame. So, for example, how much does the phrase racial capitalism engage us in worrying about what does and does not count as capitalism? And might there be racial work being done in non-capitalist societies as well? And how much does the term racial capitalism suppress the importance of intersectionality in the work that we're all doing? There's an unresolved theoretical tension, I think, between naming race as central and engaging with other forms of caste, including gender and sexuality. In particular, I see a tension between the racial capitalism frame and the discourses of settler colonialism and decolonial scholarship, which are attuned not only to anti-Blackness, but the evacuation of indigeneity in political economy. The generality of law and political economy, for the moment at least, avoids these tensions. So overall, for these reasons, I'm happy to identify my project with critical race theory, with LACRIT, with racial capitalism, and with LPE. But at the moment, I'm prioritizing the LPE frame. And I would be happy to talk about this more in the Q&A if people are interested in this question of how we frame our work. Okay, so on to my research program. I'm having problems advancing my slides.
You have 2 more minutes.
Okay, thanks. All right, so my work is on the history of LPE and American farming. And I can't get my slides to advance, so I'm just going to talk. So I'm interested, the first slide that I wish I could show you, but I can't show you, is taken from a planning document, a report issued in 1948 by the National Planning Association. And the top of it has this huge combine thresher bit of equipment, and the bottom shows Black people in the cotton fields picking cotton. And this picture represents a turning point in federal agricultural policy, the post-war decision to go all out for the mechanization of Southern agriculture in the service of what comes to be called producerism, orienting USDA around producing as much cheap food for consumers as possible. Here, this turn towards producerism is in part the result of the work of agricultural economists at the USDA and elsewhere, who were trying to figure out how to align the uncertainties of agricultural production, the processes and values of industrial production, and the cultural importance of farming as more and more Americans moved to the city. Where they landed on was the idea of modernization, which was to be imposed by statecraft and marketcraft simultaneously. The policy solution for farmers in the US was the extension of credit and government income guarantees to farmers to enable them to participate in the technological advances coming out of the agricultural colleges and agribusinesses. For those who were too poor to make this transition, they would be assisted to move to take jobs in the growing cities. And this meant undermining the South's existing agricultural political economy, which even through the New Deal period, as Veena was alluding to, remained centered on exploiting impoverished Black labor. This modernization project in the American South has an international dimension as well, which comes to the fore during the Cold War. The expertise of agricultural economists is used to promote a US-driven international development agenda, notably the Green Revolution, through which countries of the Global South were told, like the farm counties of the US South, that the key to prosperity was to import technological solutions that could boost productivity. The goal was to turbocharge agriculture as an export sector focused on inserting low-value agricultural products and raw materials into global value chains oriented toward consumers in the global and regional North. So this is a story about the interaction of marketcraft and statecraft and the role of economists as policy elites with a distinctively powerful technocratic voice. At the end of this transformation, US agriculture has become big ag as we know it today, an industry notable for enormous, hugely profitable farms, concentrated corporate power, and increasing financialization as banks, pension funds, and investment arms of insurance companies have begun investing in US farmland. As Carmen Gonzalez and others have written, the international result is a new form of market-driven post-colonial imperialism sold as development. Domestically, one of the outcomes is that Black independent farmers in the South, the US South, are thrown under the bus. Rather than include Black farmers in the modernization project, USDA incorporated and facilitated the political economy of Jim Crow in the administration of programs throughout the South. This happened in part through its own employment practices and in part because the agency administered its loan programs and technical assistance programs through decision-making bodies assembled at the county level. The segregation of the land-grant university system also plays a role in shutting Black farmers out of big ag as it evolves. Now, USDA's role in facilitating Black land loss gets litigated and then is settled at the federal level through the Pigford versus Glitman litigation, in which a class of Black farmers successfully sues USDA for credit discrimination. But the anti-discrimination model, which focuses on equal treatment and equal access to USDA programs, doesn't acknowledge the way in which US agriculture itself was a racial project from the beginning. So I'm running out of time, but in my larger project, I talk about that way in which US agriculture was shaped as a racial project, both in the terms of expropriation and dispossession of land, and in terms of hyper exploitation of Black and brown bodies, Asian bodies as well through immigration, using legal tools from slavery to immigration law. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Should I just go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Park. And really quick, I just want to say that because we're running short on time, please write your questions in the Q&A and in the chat so that we can start compiling them for the Q&A session. Thank you so much.
So let me just quickly say thank you, as everyone has, to LPE for organizing this. It's such an honor to be here with so many incredible people whose work has influenced my own so much. And thanks to everyone in the audience for taking time today to spend this time with us talking about these questions and these issues. And there's so much on the table already. I don't have slides to share. I'm just going to say a few words about how I think about doing this work and then a little bit about my own projects. So I come from this conversation on racial capitalism from outside of the legal academy. I've been engaged in the conversation for several years now with scholars who use this analytic, mostly historians, but also others, anthropologists, sociologists, planners. As many of you probably know, this is a historical, largely historical inquiry that comes out of the Black radical tradition, most famously through the work of Du Bois and Cedric Robinson, and is carried on by Robin Kelley and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and many, many others. And I have very frequently been the only lawyer in the room. And so it's just thrilling to be here with a bunch of other lawyers because we can have a different kind of conversation about law. And I'm very excited about that. And this is just to say that over the years, as I have been in conversation with these different types of scholars, I've become pretty aware of my own role in those conversations, which I've thought about as contributing to an understanding of the role of law and legal institutions. And like Angela, I also identify with LPE, with CRT, and I love actually this role of being a lawyer who also comes out of critical race studies. And this is a way that I think that this conversation in law, racial capitalism, is really connected to critical race studies, as Angela was saying, and benefits from all the work that has been done in this field because it has a very specifically practical orientation towards the law. It makes us really uniquely positioned to think about institutions and practices, legal practices that facilitate racial capitalism and its effects, the choices that people are making as they develop these practices, shape institutions, the ways that these decisions affect people's lives on the ground, and how much it matters, the ways that people respond to these institutions. And I think it is our privilege to train future lawyers about these things who will go off and put these things into practice as they continue to make the law and these institutions. Okay, so that's one thing that I very much appreciate about thinking about the law in connection with racial capitalism. And connected to that, I also want to say that because I've been between so many different conversations over the years, people who think about law, people who think about race, people who think about capitalism, and not very often all three, I really do also think every time, with every work, with every project, what is it that I'm trying to explain? What can I contribute here to an understanding about how the law works? What can I contribute here to an understanding of racial formation and its dynamics? It's a dynamic process. How is it changing in response to conditions, economic conditions, political conditions? And how can I contribute to an understanding of capitalism? Very often it's to say, well, race is everywhere, as many people on the panel have said, because so many studies of capitalism leave that part out. But it is to say it kind of requires understanding these fields separately and how they speak to each other, but also how they don't and how you could help them speak to one another. So this is, again, it's just such a pleasure to be here in a group of people who are thinking about all of those things. You don't have to do as much kind of mental gymnastics to figure out how to fill in a piece that somebody just doesn't think about. Okay. When it comes to all of these terms, they're really big terms, and it's very helpful to have a big picture conceptualization that can be very satisfying to use. But I also want to say I don't consider any of these terms to be self-evident. And I feel like also what lawyers can contribute is to providing a more precise understanding of what they mean, what kind of processes, phenomena, institutions, experiences they refer to in people's lives. So there's kind of a macro picture, but there's also the micro, and this goes back to the thing about being a lawyer. If racial formation is a dynamic process, it changes in relation to changing laws and legal institutions. Veena and Daria are speaking specifically about how the labor relationship is changing. That's not a static thing in capitalism. I think about the commodity form, which is also dynamic. I don't want people to take for granted that they already know what that is and how it works. This is what the fight is about, right? How easy is it to buy and sell interests, to foreclose, to securitize and transfer interests in land? Things like Prop 22 that are changing the labor relationship, laws about beneficial ownership, the mortgage electronic registration system. These are things I think about that change the game of what a commodity is, how wealth is accrued, and how this impacts people of color, how race becomes a resource also for these practices. So I want to say, as sort of to tie that up, is that I think because of problems of erasure and the kind of mythologies that Mehrsa started us off talking about, there's a lot we have left to understand about the development of these systems and these practices. If you are thinking about race and you are thinking about law and you are thinking about capitalism, that because that is just not an inquiry that a lot of people have engaged in altogether, this is beginning, this is very exciting. There's a lot to understand about all of that, as well as about the erasures that have taken these questions off the table. And so this is something that I've talked a lot about in my work, the question of erasure. And so here's why. How much time do I have, Tarek? I'm gonna start the part where I'm talking about my own project.
You have about 2 more minutes.
Okay, great. I'll be very brief and give a big picture. So specifically, as Tarek said at the beginning, I work on the history of the property system in the United States, the creation of the real estate market, and specifically its creation through the histories of colonization and enslavement. And it really, I really think of it as a very simple thing. You know, for about 250 years until abolition, the whole colonial period and much of the early republic, the vast majority of property that Anglo-Americans held consisted of lands taken by force from native nations and human beings subjugated and enslaved by force. Around 75% on the eve of the revolution, that's a lot. So it's a massive amount of property that we're talking about. And you know that the law had something to do with that, with producing that property, with protecting that property. And so I view it as my goal to understand how those processes shaped the law of property in America, in the American colonies, and then in the United States. It seems simple, but it's not, in part because of the erasures. So I spent quite a lot of time mapping these erasures, trying to understand how these topics dropped out of the understanding of what constitutes the field, and have documented it and shown, you know, this is kind of where it can't help but appear, but also the ways that these stories have been suppressed and how people have not looked at what happened in order to understand the system that we have. And if you do look at the system that we have, I'll just say there's 2 things about it that I feel like are really significant, which would change our conversation about issues that we face now if we were to take them as a point of departure. One, you know, for a really long time in other countries, especially England, where a lot of our traditions were brought from, our legal traditions, property law was intended to stabilize the status quo, to keep things as they were. If someone was in possession, you left them in possession. This is an ancient Roman law principle of property. Here, the entire project is one of dispossession. It is the exact opposite of that. It requires overturning the possession of so many people. And for that reason, it is a project that requires a lot of force, organized in racial terms, because that is the mandate of the European project of conquest. And so you have a racial hierarchy guiding all this activity. The question about the relationship between law and force is a central question of law, and we have not examined it in terms of the massive dispossession it enacted of people, of their lands, of their own liberty, to the scale where markets could be created from these lands and people for hundreds of years. And so that's one thing I think we really need to take stock of, is the fact that our laws and institutions have been shaped by processes designed not to maintain the status quo or protect stability or to create sustainable conditions under which people can thrive. They were created to subvert existing possession, to further dispossession, and make this property extremely liquid, transferable fast to produce profits in exchange very quickly in unprecedented ways. And this problem is not just macro, it's micro. A lot of the basic elements of the property system we have now, the survey system, the way that we make an enclosure, the survey system, the title registration system, the comprehensive registry, easy foreclosure, every aspect of the system has been, were innovations developed in the process of colonization in order to churn this property out faster and trade those interests faster and keep the credit streams from Europe open. So you can see how that leads to
Professor Park, we're running really behind, so sorry to cut you off, but I just wanted to make sure that we get to our last panelist. If you want to just close out really quick so we can move on.
Thanks for keeping us on track, Tarek. We really all appreciate it. That's essentially what I had to say. That's the main interest I have in the land system and the question that I have that drives me and sends me back to the beginning of the creation of that system. Thanks so much.
Okay, can everybody hear me? I have very little time, and we definitely want to get to Q&A. So I'm not going to do the play screen because it takes longer. So this is part of a project. I want to talk to you about a project that's part of a broader project, a book called Racism Pays. And my fellow panelists have set up the framework for thinking about these things in a beautiful way. So I'm just going to jump right in to talk about the project. The project that I'm going to talk to you about has many facets, but I want to concentrate on two today, two central arguments for this talk. First, that the digital economy offers new opportunities for racial exploitation, or as Athena and Nancy Fraser would say, expropriation. And second, I want to propose a reconceptualization of worker ownership, a radicalization of worker ownership that allows us to fight capitalism with capital. So we're all familiar, as Tarek said at the beginning, with the arguments from history about the way in which historical innovations have relied on racial exploitation. As he mentioned, the global cotton economy couldn't have launched without slavery and the theft of indigenous land. Transcontinental commerce wouldn't be possible without indentured Chinese railroad workers. But I want to talk about two modern instantiations of that recurring theme. The innovation that we celebrate relies on centrally racial exploitation to get off the ground. And in particular, in the book, I talk about the way in which the digital platform transport system that Veena writes about could not have gotten off the ground without full-time drivers of color. The artificial intelligence industry could not have gotten off the ground without ghost workers from India and other global South countries, M-Turk workers in particular. And in general, both of these innovations point to the idea that workers of color are used by digital innovators as a blitz scale labor force to launch innovations with massive numbers of workers very cheaply at half price or lower, owing to earlier racial exploitation. So just to touch on each of those briefly, because what I want to do is mostly theoretical. For rideshare platforms, as they were launching, 10% of the drivers were responsible for 50% of the rides. Those were full-time workers, and 70% of them were people of color and or immigrants. So this is a reserve labor force that gets used both centrally and in reserve to launch digital transport. In the artificial intelligence world, 30% of workers who were working on labeling data for the purposes of object recognition worked full-time, and 60% of those workers were from India or other global South countries, making half the wage of what a US worker would make. And so you see these workers of color being able to launch innovations at scale for half-price wages. The points that I really want to explore here are points about modern racial monopsony. The argument here is that workers of color are trapped by earlier racial exploitation. Earlier structural and intentional exploitation means that workers of color can't find another job and are more likely to be fired. And so we could actually quantify exploitability in terms of coming up with a number. If you wanted to create a number, you could create the ratio of job offers for the unemployed to jobs lost for people who are employed. And this has been done generally, but I think we should do it by racial group. And we could quantify the exploitability of workers of color, like those workers I mentioned, who help launch innovations. We can also think about the way in which power is concentrated. Marshall Steinbaum's work and others talk about the way in which the digital space has become more concentrated, which means there are fewer employers, less choices for workers. And in addition to having more exploitability for people of color, we also have more exploitative jobs, as Veena has so brilliantly demonstrated. And I want to add that in these independent contracting jobs, employers are setting the price. It isn't the independent contractor for both the drivers and MTurk workers, which means that more surplus value is extracted from workers of color, and they're not paid their marginal revenue product. We can think of this as vulture capitalism. Reid Hoffman has actually talked about the way that the digital economy has been made brighter because you can hire, exploit, and fire in a matter of minutes without even knowing the worker's name. And that's definitely true for ghost workers, and I would suggest also for digital transport workers. So what can we do about this? I'm exploring together with some colleagues in South Africa who are interested in this. 1-2 punch. The one part of the punch is organizing in collective action institutions, and those are already emerging. Rideshare Drivers United, We Are Dynamo for the data labelers, and these organizations are pushing for things like Bill of Rights, which focus on wages and conditions. But I'm also interested in exploring radical worker ownership. And by that, I don't mean the co-ops and other forms of worker ownership that conventionally get discussed, but instead inclusive early ownership programs in which the innovator would be required to offer an early gig worker, like the MTurk worker who launched artificial intelligence, like the drivers who launched Uber and Lyft. They must offer those early gig workers both a minimum wage and early employee stock that they have to issue, just as they do for other early employees, to put in a trust for full-time platform workers. And that trust would obviously play an important governance role in controlling the company as it gets off the ground. And then to the extent that the innovation is successful, they can include employee stock ownership plans that give stock as part of the retirement compensation. So the notion of redistributing both control and profits is a really important part of revisioning the way we think about capitalism, fighting capitalism with capital, giving these early workers both control over the workplace and profits that accrue to the value added that they have offered for these innovators is a way of reconceptualizing how we think about both worker ownership and racial exploitation. So I'm going to stop there.
Yay, thank you so much for our panelists today. If we could get a round of applause for everybody who spoke today on such amazing topics and so informative. And I'm going to jump right into asking questions from the chat that I've been noting because we're short on time. So I'm just going to ask a string of questions that people have typed in the chat, and then the panelists can kind of pick and choose what questions they'd like to ask. Some of them are specified to specific panelists and others are more general. But if a question is specified and panelists, you have a thought, please feel free to jump in as well. So Jack Leviton writes in to say, I would love to hear Professor Harris talk a bit more about the relationship between the frames of racial capitalism and settler colonialism. What are the tensions? And while I was reading this, I just had another thought. Panelists, if you want to respond to these questions in the chat, that's also a good idea, just to make sure that we're getting as many answers out there as possible. So again, Jack Leviton says, I would love to hear Professor Harris talk a bit more about the relationship between the frames of racial capitalism and settler colonialism. What are the tensions? Next, Luke O'Bannon writes in to ask, what legal political policies have been effective in using these principles in solving inequity? Who has done this well, or who is currently applying the LPE principles? The next question is comes from I didn't get the name, but it's a good question. So they write in they kind of have two questions. First, the panel's understanding of racial capitalism seems to be one of homogenized racial minority. However, intra-non-white racial exploitation also happens. See examples of Chinese companies in Africa. How does LPE engage with such a dynamic? And then secondly, for Professor Harris, how would the LPE framework be used to understand the push through institutional economics towards the contract farming for countries in the global South? And then finally, how does the LPE view the appointment of Black female head of the WTO, given its role in shaping laws that drive neoliberal capital accumulation? And then the last question that we got in before I stopped checking the chat was for Professor Park. From your historical look at property laws, do you have any thoughts on how we should rethink taking on California's Prop 13 property tax limits? And panelists, if you want me to repeat any of those questions, please feel free to ask.
Well, I can jump in on a couple of the questions that had were specifically directed to me. One was the question about what the tensions between racial capitalism and settler colonialism as frames. I don't think that they are inherent tensions, because racial capitalism and settler colonialism can both be elastic terms. But I do worry about the equation of race, the race in racial capitalism with Blackness and with slavery, to the extent that people frame that and are not thinking about indigeneity and the settler colonial project at the same time. I see the potential for misunderstanding. And I'm thinking in part about the distance that's been somewhat there between, for example, critical race theory and indigenous studies, which is due in part to a legal tension between to what extent indigeneity struggles are framed in terms of race in the first place, and to what extent they're framed in a different way. So I think those tensions are possible and incipient. I don't think they're necessarily unresolvable, but I do see in light of that question that hasn't really been thoroughly surfaced and resolved, the possibility of estrangement or misunderstanding between those who are primarily taking settler colonialism as a frame and those who are primarily taking racial capitalism as a frame. And on the question of how LPE looks at contract farming in the global South, I think the work of Carmen Gonzalez is kind of a wonderful example of LPE applied in this broader framework, because she really looks at the laws of international trade and the imposition, again, this idea of bringing peasant farmers and other kinds of farmers into these international circuits of global capital, which results in really the extraction, their marginalization and the extraction of raw materials and repurposed into sources of for consumers in the global North. So I'll stop there because there's a lot more questions on the table.
So I want to jump in at this point because I think that Angela just referenced Carmen's work, and I think also on the piece I just did in class crits, we're really relying on Quijano's work, and that's Quijano. And the way that work has been developed, it really talks about how racial capitalism, the way it's understood, is that the process of racialization is broad and fluid and was based in colonialism. And so what that means is that racialization depends on kind of where you're looking. So racialization in Brazil is very different from racialization in South Africa, is very different in China, in Korea. And so when we talk about racialization, we are talking about indigenous racialization. We are talking about Black-white racialization. We are talking about immigrant racialization. We are talking about mix. And so it really depends. So one of the examples that we give also with religion, right? So we talk about when we start talking about proto-racialization, we talk about the way the English racialized the Irish, and they did so through religion. We talk about the way the Muslim religion has been racialized in the current moment, how ethnicity with Mexican Americans has been racialized. So the concept of racialization, I think, in racial capitalism really captures those different things. So a couple of the panelists talked about the way in which capitalism, however you think of it, racial capitalism changes, and it changes with material conditions, and it changes kind of depending on when and where. What do you think about these different people laboring in different spaces and how that specific process of racialization proceeded? So I think all of those are there. So I don't think we're talking about a homogenized minority when we're doing this work, or at least maybe some of us are, but some of us not. The connections and disconnections between kind of racial capitalism and settler colonial analyses, I think there's work to be done there. But again, I think probably like Angela, that there's work to be done there, and there can be easy misunderstandings that those are kind of separate sorts of analyses. I'm not so sure that has to be. A lot of this is coming out of decolonial work, at least in part, and I think they can be captured. Now, it may be that specific points may be better analyzed through one frame or another, but I'm not so sure they have to be in tension.
So I'll jump in here to answer a question that was actually asked on the chat about whether racial capitalism can be used only with regard to domestic racial configurations in the US, or whether it applies more broadly to the global divisions of colonialism and imperialism. And I think from my project, which talks quite a bit about digital workers in the global South, we can re-describe the kinds of relationships that get mapped out as imperialism and colonialism in racial terms. And that's a long project that I could say more about, but I think the key point to make here is that intellectual property law, as per what Kay Sue was saying, operates to deepen the divide between global North haves and global South have-nots. The use of intellectual property to extract profits from the crippling need of Black and brown COVID patients in the US and in other countries of the global South is a perfect example that the disproportionate need that they have comes from a history of exploitation, expropriation, and expulsion. And intellectual property law gets layered on top of that, where the profits from the COVID vaccine, for example, are going to be going disproportionately to white capital. So I think it applies much more broadly. Lisa Iglesias's work, to reiterate what Angela was saying, is a really great entry point into that kind of work. So yeah, I'll stop there.
There was another question on property, I think, that was directed to Kay Sue.
Yes. So that question was there were so that question was from a historical look at property laws. Do y'all have any thoughts on how we should rethink taking on California's Prop 13 property tax limits? And then there's another question about property too that asks, how does the racial capitalism framework How is the racial capitalism framework used in the analysis of global intellectual property law? Or is racial capitalism only useful in analyzing and understanding US domestic politics and laws?
That's the question I just answered, Tarek.
Sorry for that. I'm trying to keep up with all the questions in the chat, so. So we did just get another couple of questions. One participant wants to know how the farmer protest in India or its analysis might look if investigated through the lens of racial capitalism, or should we bring caste and religion into that analysis?
I mean, maybe I'll just pipe in a little bit on that point, which is just to say, you know, and this goes back to what an earlier attendee asked. We're all working with race as a construction, right? As something that is not clearly defined in any sort of natural way. And so it's a very, racial capitalism, I think, is a very useful framework if we think about, again, about race in broad construction and deconstructive terms, way to think about a lot of what happens in the global South, particularly in India. I mean, we're still talking about, with people with very little power, laborers who are themselves racialized in particular ways, both through colonialism and through the post-colonial neoliberal state. You know, it's not a completely clean comparison, but I think it is, again, a very useful framework. And going back to Angela's point about the relationship between racial capitalism and settler colonialism, that these are interrelated, elastic ideas. And so, you know, I continue to think of it as actually quite useful, considering that elasticity in the Indian, in the subcontinent context.
I can just add that in the work that I'm looking at, there's a way in which at the same time that the modernization project is throwing Black farmers in the South off of their land, it's also being marshaled as a tool for disempowering peasant farmers in the global South. So there is clearly kind of this interrelation of what's happening domestically and what's happening internationally. And I think one of the benefits of settler colonialism as a frame is that it explicitly calls attention to this as an international project. But as Athena said, we can also understand racial capitalism as encompassing the same series of projects, as long as we keep in mind that race isn't something that only happens in the US.
And
Yeah.
I think,
Sorry, go ahead.
no, I think that at least the way Carmen and I are thinking about this, that and I think a lot of people might agree um, in terms of capitalism, that is that it was born a global system. It's a global system. Racial capitalism is a global system. It is not just a nation state system. And even when you start thinking about its origins, right, kind of what comes first. And there are a lot of debates about how capitalism arises and whether we kind of buy this market story. Did it arise through trade? On the one hand, or another kind of story? Did it arise when you saw kind of the seizure of production? Those are two very different kind of stories. But at least in the market story, it's very clear it's about trade and it's about conquest and it's about taking over markets, even under its merchant capitalist forms, those very, very early forms of capitalism. And so I think we conceptualize it perhaps wrongly, right? Our stuff is tentative. We're in the midst of it. That this is a global system and has been global almost since its birth. I do have a question for Kay-Sue, if you, unless another audience question, Tarek.
I think Kesu had to leave.
Oh, did she? Oh, okay.
So I guess I have one more question, and then we'll see if we have any more. I think that the chat is beginning to dry up a little bit, but I wanted to ask you guys if you could maybe explain a little bit more about how an LPE framework relates to racial capitalism generally, and how those frameworks can be applied to begin to identify racial capitalist structures and address needs of vulnerable workers of color.
So I know Angela has a lot to say about this. I'll just say one thing, which is the notion of a democratized economy means a democratized workplace and workforce. And I think this is where scholarship on workers of color that thinks about things like radical worker ownership fits really well into the law and political economy framework, because that framework focuses on a democratized economy. And it's all about control and power. And I think the question about how to democratize with an eye towards racialization processes that have stratified the American workforce into white workers and workers of color is one that we definitely need to spend some time thinking about. And I think law and political economy is a really great place to do that kind of work.
Athena, were you going to say something?
No, I was going to ask you to say something.
I guess, this comes back to what I was saying in my my initial remarks, which is that I think there's a way in which all of these frames are pretty overlapping and build on one another and draw from one another. So there's a sense in which I think, racial capitalism, CRT, LPE, all can encompass this work that's being done at the convergence of markets, states, and race, right? What I think is useful about LPE, again, is that because it's trying to kind of go back to ground zero and ask, well, what is politics? What is economics? How does law shape market craft and statecraft? Those are great places to bring in the question of, well, who is all of this for? How does it work and who is it for? And that when we think about democratizing the economy, we also have to be thinking about who is the demos, right? And how is it constructed? And what are the ways in which race really shapes who we think about the people? Whether in the economic sense, as Daria was getting at with the idea of segregated labor markets, or whether we're thinking in terms of citizenship and whose voices count within a nation, or in its other kind of some other kind of state formation. So I like LPE for that that openness to that inquiry, but I think the work of racial capitalism is doing something very, very similar. So, so both frameworks, I think, are really useful.
All right, and so we are officially past time. We had 80 people stay all the way till 12:40, which is a testament to our amazing panelists and speakers, as well as the very, very important work that they're all doing. So again, I just want to take a second to thank the panelists, and if you could type in the chat your thanks or do the round of applause, weird thing that we're all doing on Zoom now. And I also just want to take a second again to thank the organizers of the LPE project for putting on this great event. And with that, I hope you'll come to our next event, check out the blog. And I know that Professor Harris posted another conference that is happening with the Professor Harris. I don't remember all the details. Do you want to quickly jump in and just say?
Yeah, I threw it in the chat a second ago. Go to classcrits.org and you'll be able to register for the next panel, March 10th, 5 p.m. Eastern on racial capitalism. So hope to see some of you there.
Yes, and then there were a couple of questions that we didn't get to. Thank you everybody for being so engaged and for sending us questions. And I'm sorry that if we didn't get to them, but please stay engaged with the LPE, with the LPE community, and hopefully your questions will be answered by amazing scholars. So thank you everybody for joining and have a great day.
Thank you so much, Tarek, for leading and organizing us, and to LPE as well.